The title of this talk is Cerebral Cortex Evolution. This talk will be conducted in a question and answer format. The first question: the human cerebral cortex is around dash square feet. A 1.5, B 2.5, C 3.5, D 0.5. 4 steps are needed to find the cerebral cortical area. The first one involves the lateral surface of the brain. The lateral surface of the brain must be stretched to iron all its kinks and then measured to determine its area. The second step also involves the lateral surface of the brain, and it requires performing a parasitical cut to reveal the insula, then stretching it as we did before for the whole of the lateral surface and measuring it to determine its area. The third step we must take to find the area of the cerebral cortex is to go to the mesial inferior surface of the brain, making sure we include the inferior surface of the frontal lobe and grabbing the whole mesial inferior surface by its most distant ends, stretch it, then measure it and find the area. The fourth and last step we must take is to add all the surfaces area to find the total area of the stretched cerebral cortex, which I am represented in this frame. The total area of the cerebral cortex has been estimated to be in the average of 2.5 square feet, which is about 1/4 of a square meter. So the answer to this question is B. Next question. The cerebral cortex is from 0.5 to 4.5 millimeter thick. A true, B false. This figure represents the area of the stretched cerebral cortex. As you know, the cerebral cortex is made of convolutions which form gyra and sulci. On the top of the convolutions, we find the crest of the gyrus, and on the bottom, the depth of the sulci. In general, the cerebral cortex is thickest at the crest of the gyrus and thinnest at the depth of the sulcus. But overall, we can say that the thinnest cerebral cortex is 0.5 millimeters in evolutionary older regions of the brain. Thicker cortices 1.5 millimeter in the primary visual cortex, which house large numbers of very small neurons, and 4.5 millimeters in the primary motor cortex, which houses the largest neurons in the cerebral cortex, the bed cells. The primary visual cortex and the primary motor cortex are part of the evolutionary new cerebral cortex. So the answer to this question is A. Next question. About 95% of the human brain surface is neocortex. A true, B false. The cerebral cortex has, from an evolutionary perspective, 3 types of cortices. The neocortex, such as the primary visual cortex and primary motor cortex. The neocortex occupy about 95% of the cerebral cortex in human. The archicortex, a cortex evolutionary older than the neocortex, constitute about 3.5%, and the paleocortex, the evolutionary oldest cortex, constitute the rest, about 1.5%. Together, the archicortex and the paleocortex occupy about 5% of the human cerebral cortex. The term allocortex, which means the odd cortex, is used by some authors to refer to the archicortex and the paleocortex combined. These authors often use the term peri-allocortex to denote the transition area between the allocortex and the neocortex. There is one more thing I must mention regarding the evolutionary classification of cortices. Some authors believe that the archicortex and not the paleocortex is the oldest evolutionary cortex. For this talk, we will consider paleocortex as being the oldest. So the answer to this question is A. Next question. The paleocortex is the olfactory brain. A true, B false. This is an inferior view of the brain. You can see the cerebellum and the brainstem hiding some of the cerebral cortex. Now I want to call your attention to the cut and removal of the anterior segment of the right temporal lobe, which was done to be able to appreciate the part of the inferior surface of the frontal lobe that was hidden by the anterior segment of the temporal lobe. I have now in this frame added a blue rectangle labeled paleocortex, which is, or at least most authors I have read believe is, the oldest cortex. This cortex is found at the olfactory bulbs, the olfactory tubercles, which in human is not superficially seen, but it is found in the depth of the anterior perforated substance and the diagonal band of Broca. The third major component of the paleocortex is constituted by parts of the piriform lobe. The piriform lobe is an unfortunate term used to indicate the anterior portion of the temporal lobe medial to the rhinal sulcus. It includes the oncus, the lateral olfactory stria, and the anterior part of the parahippocampal gyrus. The part of the piriform lobe considered part of the paleocortex are the ambient and semilunar gyri. These structures are mesial to the rhinal sulcus. The structures listed in this frame constitute the olfactory brain. The olfactory brain, by being the oldest part of the cerebral cortex, has been granted privileges, at least one privilege. Smell is the only sense that does not go through the thalamus to reach the cortex. So the answer to this question is A. Next question. Our olfactory brains were bigger ones. A true, B false. This frame holds the images of the inferior view of three brains. The first one corresponds to a 4-month fetus. I have shaded the area corresponding to the right olfactory brain, compared its size with the rest of the non-olfactory inferior surface of the cerebrum, anteriorly and posteriorly. Now look at the other fetal brain. It corresponds to a fetus few weeks older. Look at the size of the left olfactory brain and again compare it with the rest of the inferior surface of the brain in the front and in the back. Now look at the human brain. Now let's look at an adult human brain. I have shaded the right and the left olfactory brain. Notice the small area occupied by the olfactory brain in the adult compared with the area occupied by the olfactory brain in the two fetal brains. So the answer to this question is A. Next question. The archicortex includes the hippocampal formation, the fasciola cisnera, the supracallosal gyrus, the paraterminal gyrus, and the cortex covering the oncus. A true, B false. This question mentioned 5 different structures. At this point, I will say a few things about each of them. The first structure mentioned is the hippocampal formation. You will be hearing much about the hippocampal formation in the future But for now, I want to mention a few salient features that can be seen in this specimen. I have labeled here the temporal tip in order to orient ourselves. I have now shaded the left temporal horn of the lateral ventricle. I am now indicating to the left amygdala. In this frame, I have schematically added the part of the amygdala that has been removed. And now remove this imaginary part so you can get a better concept of what is missing. I will now use this specimen to show the visible parts of the hippocampal formation when viewed from above with the roof of the temporal horn removed. The arrow points to the hippocampus proper. The new arrow points to the hippocampal digitations. And this one to the dentate gyrus. This is a coronal view cut through the hippocampal formation. You can imagine that this formation once was a regular gyrus, becoming bent and then bent again until forming the hippocampal formation we see in this specimen. The second structure mentioned in this question is the fasciola cisnera. Again, for orientation, I am indicating the area of the tip of the temporal lobe, which, by the way, has been cut off in order to see better the area in question. The shaded area represents the temporal horn of the lateral ventricle. Now I am pointing to the occipital horn, the trigone, the area of confluence of the previously mentioned horns with the posterior segment of the frontal horn. Now I am indicating the hippocampus, the dentate gyrus, and the fasciola cisnera, which is also called the fasciolar gyrus. This name is given to the cortex that occupies the space between the indusium recessium, to which I will refer in a minute, and the dentate gyrus. The third structure mentioned in this question is the supracallosal gyrus. This is the name given to the gray matter above the corpus callosum. Viewed from above, the supracallosal gyrus looks like a thin covering of gray color applied to the corpus callosum. This thin cover is called the indusium griseum, here indicated anteriorly by the two brackets, and here more posteriorly. I have now added an enlargement of the superior surface of the corpus callosum that allows us to see the indusium griseum a little bit better. We can also see in the specimen in the middle of this frame the left longitudinal stria, one lateral and the other one medial. On the right, we have the same stria. The lateral, here indicated in the enlarged view, and the medial longitudinal stria, again here indicated in the enlarged view. The fourth structure mentioned in this question is the paraterminal gyrus. In the mesial view of the brain, you can see the corpus callosum and the subcallosal area. You can also see a ribbon-like structure indicated here, which is called the lamina terminalis. The paraterminal gyrus is between them. The fifth structure mentioned in this question is the cortex covering the oncus. In this frame, I have shaded some of the areas we have mentioned. Notice that we have labeled them as archicortex. Inferiorly, you see the mesial region of the temporal lobe. Now I am pointing to the cortex covering the oncus. Most authors I have read considered this region as being part of the archicortex as it is indicated here. The area in front, the semilunar and ambient gyri, part of the paleocortex, and the area behind, that is the entorhinal cortex, a transitional area between the archicortex and the neocortex. Hence, it is often labeled as periallocortex. So the answer to this question is A. Next question. The percentage of neocortex in a human is higher than the percentage of neocortex in the brain of a lemur. A true, B false. So far, we have talked about the human cerebral cortex being classified based on evolutionary principles, but not about the cerebral cortex in lower animals. I will now compare human with animal brains to illustrate the nature of the evolutionary classification of the cerebral cortex. The paleocortex, as we have mentioned, is the oldest cortical structure. Next in line is the archicortex, and then comes the neocortex. In this frame, I am introducing a hedgehog, a tupaia, a lemur, a monkey, and a human. The hedgehog has a funny looking shaped brain. The neocortex occupies the dorsal surface. The archicortex, the lower part of the mesial surface, with most of it extending internally. Thus, it is only exposed to the surface in a relatively small area indicated by the arrow. And the paleocortex. The paleocortex occupy the lower lateral and inferior surface of the brain. In addition, we can also see the ventricles hugging the archicortex, and the rest is white matter, as you can see in this frame. The tupaia brain also has a funny looking shape. The paleocortex area has decreased in relation to the hedgehog. The archicortex has increased in size minimally, but most importantly, due to the peculiar selective brain growth, it has begun to migrate downwards and has lost its representation in the mesial surface of the brain that was present in the hedgehog. And the neocortex has definitely increased in size. The lemur brain shape is more in line with the human brain. The paleocortex has decreased. The archicortex has probably increased some, and certainly have continued its inferior migration. The neocortex has increased. Now comes the human, with our well-recognized brain shape. Were we to do a coronal cut going from the posterior frontal area to the pons, we would see a rather familiar appearance, and all components we have seen in lower animals would be present. But now, the neocortex occupies all the lateral surface, the mesial surface, and most of the inferior surface in this cut. The archicortex has only a vestigial representation in the dorsal region as the indusium griseum, the bulk being inferiorly placed, forming the hippocampus formation and the cortex covering the oncus. The paleocortex is not visible in this cut, which is the one I am indicating by the arrow. To see it, we must make a more anterior cut at the same angle, going from the midfrontal region to the anterior temporal region, such as indicated in this frame. This cut will yield a specimen as represented here. Now we can see the paleocortex at the mesioinferior surface of the cerebrum in the area corresponding to the olfactory brain. In relation to other animals, the human brain percentage of paleocortex is much smaller. The percentage of archicortex is also smaller, and the percentage of neocortex is much more increased. So the answer to this question is true. Next question. Dorsal or superior migration of the archicortex dictates the final position of the hippocampus. A true, B false. The platypus has a peculiar brain. This is a photograph of a coronal cut impregnated with a neuronal stain. The hippocampal formation in this cut can only be seen dorsally. The human brain cut at a comparable level has a definitely proportional smaller hippocampal formation, and dorsally it has the indusium griseum. The indusium griseum, the remnants of the dorsally placed hippocampus in lower animal, is so small that the area where it is has to be enlarged in order to be able to see it, as you can see in this frame. Here I have pointed to the right and the left indusium griseum using the magenta arrows. I am showing you the platypus again to include a parasital cut. Notice the small size of the hippocampal formation inferiorly and its large size superiorly. In humans, in a cut at a similar level, you can see that the hippocampus is located ventrally. So the answer to this question is B. Next question. The percentage of association cortex in relation to primary cortex increases with evolution. A true, B false. Here we have the hedgehog again. The brain of the hedgehog has less neocortex than paleocortex. The archicortex, as you know, is not seen in the lateral view because it's only represented mesially. The neocortex in the hedgehog is occupied by the motor cortex in the frontal region. Behind you find the somatosensory cortex, and behind it you find the visual cortex. These constitute the primary cortices visible in the lateral surface. The association cortex, that is the cortex that integrates the information from the primary cortices in these animals, occupies the rest of the neocortex. The tupaya has probably more neocortex than paleocortex, and the primary cortex has the same distribution. Notice that the motor cortex maintains its anterior position in relation to the sensory cortices. The association cortex occupies the rest of the neocortex. Hence, the tupaya has a higher percentage of association cortex than the hedgehog. The lemur certainly has more neocortex than paleocortex. The primary cortices present in the lateral surface include the primary auditory cortex. So we have the motor cortex most anteriorly, then comes the somatosensory cortex, and the vision is in the back, but also in the lateral surface, close to the somatosensory cortex, we can now see the area for hearing that we could not see in lower species. The association cortex occupies the rest of the neocortex. So lemur have more association cortex than tupaya. Now comes the human. The neocortex occupy a much larger area than the paleocortex. The primary cortex occupy a relatively small area, and the association cortex occupies a much larger area. So humans have more association cortex than lemur. It is the size and the connections of our association cortex that makes us human. So the answer to this question is true. The next question is, recognizing the smell of a rose involves the thalamus. A true, B false. When we talked about smell, we said that age has its privileges. And for the olfactory system, the privilege is that its receptor go through the olfactory bulb to reach the primary olfactory cortex without going through the thalamus. Yet smell needs to go to the thalamus in order to reach the secondary olfactory cortex, where smell is recognized. In addition, the olfactory bulb sends fibers to the amygdala and the anterior perforated substance. So the answer to this question is A. Next question. Layering occurs in all the cerebral surface. A true, B false. The histological arrangement of the cerebral cortex is complex. The drawing, as the one you see in this frame representing the neocortex, makes identification of the different layers an easy exercise. Yet, in real histological specimen, it is not the case. And as alluded previously, the confusing terminology used for different type of cortex does not help. In this frame, I have tried to bring together, as best I could, a summary of the most important features as I understand them. Layering is most clearly seen at the neocortex. I find it harder to see the layering in the agranular neocortex present in the motor cortex than in the granular neocortex as present in the primary visual cortex. The neocortex, as previously stated, covers most of the human cortex. But in the prior explanation, when we adjudicated the percentage of the different types of cerebral cortex, the mesocortex was not mentioned. I have rationalized this omission by thinking that the mesocortex is evolutionary in par with the neocortex, regardless, as we will see, to the lesser number of layers it has. The mesocortex corresponds to the areas of the cortex with 4 to 5 layers. This cortex, according to some authors, is found in the paralimbic areas, the insula, cingulate gyrus, retrosplenial area, parahippocampal gyrus, temporal pole, caudal orbitofrontal cortex, and the subcallosal area. Yet, as I hope you recall, earlier in this talk, I labeled some of these regions as being covered by the archicortex. The archicortex is constituted by the hippocampal formation. The archicortex is considered by some, but not most authors, the evolutionary oldest cortex. It has 3 layers in most textbooks. The paleocortex also has 3 layers, and together with the archicortex is called the allocortex. The paleocortex is found in the primary olfactory cortex and related olfactory cortical regions. And finally, there are cortical areas that not even those with great imagination can find trace of layering. These area is called as a unit the corticoid area. The corticoid area, as previously mentioned, is not layered. It is found in the basal forebrain, occupying the septal area, substantia innominata, and the cortical region of the amygdaloid complex. Interestingly enough, this area considered cortical because they are in the surface of the brain, but also because they have neurotransmitters and cortical connections similar to other regions in the cortex. So the answer to this question is B. Thank you very much for your attention.